Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit, and let's have a gander at Below. Oh my. This game has been delayed for a while. It was announced in 2013 at a Microsoft event, and it's by Capybara Games. Those are the fellows behind Super Time Force, Super Brothers Sword and Sorcery, and a few other things as well. And this, well, this is yet another Zelda-inspired, kind of Soulsy, kind of roguey sort of thing. It's a common theme, isn't it? That seems to be the biggest theme of PAX this year, as we've run into games that have had those sort of inspirations, although I don't think many of them have been in development as long as this one. This originates from a time when the Souls-like and the roguelites and even the Zelda-like games were not necessarily the cause du jour. And it's been in development now for over 3 years. And the result, at least this demonstration, is really quite striking, although you might have to go full screen on this one because the main character is incredibly small. They use a technique similar to tilt-shift photography in order to create a massive sense of scale here for Below. So the main character is absolutely tiny, although I think you're going to get the Zelda-esque feel. Remember some of the Game Boy games or the Game Boy Advance versions of Zelda where the main character was very, very small? It's kind of like that. And the combat is probably going to remind you a little bit of Zelda as well, although somewhat more advanced. Currently exploring this area, and this is nothing particularly special at the moment, but you'll see that I'm able to turn on my lantern. Now, the lantern is a special item, and when you die, you will drop it. There is only one lantern in the entire game. But you will be revived as a different character every time you get a different character, and you'll be able to retrieve the stuff that your previous character dropped, including the lantern. If you lose the lantern, it's gone forever, which is a very interesting little idea. You always have to go down and find it and get it from the dungeons below. It's a very important item. Helps ward off enemies. It, of course, provides light and can be upgraded as well. So it's certainly worth keeping a hold of because this is a relatively dark game. I'd like to shut up for a second and let you soak in the atmosphere of this area because there are not only some incredible lighting effects, but some really interesting ambient sounds as well, and a feeling of solemn loneliness in this strange and dangerous world here. Man, that sound design is really something special. I don't think we stop enough to appreciate ambient sound design in games like this. Yeah, we like to glorify the soundtrack of titles, and I love video game music a great deal, but something like this not only has some really interesting atmospheric music, but some really awesome ambient detail. Sounds like you're really in a cave and you're waving around a torch. The lighting effects in this are nothing short of phenomenal. This is using an interesting little engine that has actually powered games like Journey. It's not a commonly used engine, but it generates some incredible effects that don't look too similar to some of the more mainstream engines, so gives it a very unique look combined with this tilt-shift photography effect. The name of the engine is called Phyre, P-H-Y-R-E, if you want to look it up. It was released in 2012. It's been used for quite a lot of different indie games, but most of them don't look anywhere near this good. No doubt about that. I mean, it was used for games like Dive Kick and things like that, which is a little bit weird. Burn Zombie Burn. Hotline Miami actually used it as well. But it certainly created a very unique look here. Now, the question is, what's going on with the gameplay? Well, it is a dungeon exploration game, certainly, and I mentioned the roguelite aspect before of permadeath, although in this case it's more about your character dies, you can go into the dungeon, which will have changed since you came back, with a new character, and you can go and find your old gear and things like that. But it's certainly very Zelda-inspired in terms of its dungeon crawling, but it also has crafting and survival elements to it. You may notice down the bottom here, and I do apologize for the black bars. We had a slight problem with the resolution the game was rendering out with the capture. But the little indicators down the bottom indicate that my character is actually thirsty and hungry. If I allow my character to starve or to become so dehydrated he falls over, then that is death. So you do have to watch out for that. You'll be able to collect different ingredients in the world in order to create various soups. And this is the crafting system right here, actually crafting some torches at the moment rather than soups. There's a separate little menu for making soups, and you could put in pretty much anything plus water will give you a basic soup, and the different ingredients will allow you to concoct different recipes, which will give you bonuses and allow you to survive. This little area right here is, I believe, what they called the pocket. And it's a little safe area that appears in each of the different dungeons, despite the fact that the dungeon changes every time you go down. And this is where you can store items for future runs. So you can store items here, and then a future character can come here and pick them up. So there is an element of permanence, an element of persistence, and this is also a nice area to rest, and it's completely safe and a good place to craft and prepare for your journey below. I love that little fade out effect there. It's really quite a wonderful little thing. And this might be one of the most beautiful games I've ever seen, honestly. I think the unusual perspective helps a lot, but there's just so much little detail in it, including the reflection in the water and things like that. So you notice there I was able to just drink from the pool of water on the bottom there, which made things a little bit simple. And we found ourselves a little cave here, and in this cave there are a couple of items. Now, the weapon system is a two-weapon system for the most part. You can pick up a secondary weapon, or you can swap out what you've currently got. You, by default, have a sword and shield, but you can swap your shield out. You can use a torch instead, if you wish, which will allow you to chase off things like bats and creatures of the night, although it will disable some of your defensive abilities. You can swap out to a spear. You can get a bow and arrow, which requires arrows which can be crafted as well. So there is a decent amount of combat variety even available on level 1 of the dungeon here. Here I'm swapping out my shield to my torch, which means I now have a torch, which I can attack with, by the way, and a sword. So I could go with that, which is kind of a sort of dual wield setup, and which is also very handy for navigation when I don't want to use my lantern. Or I can use a ranged weapon, or I can go defensive. And we haven't encountered anything to fight just yet, so let's show you a little bit of the combat. Here we are on level 1 of the dungeon. Now, we don't really know what's going on here, and of course there's a fog of war, but we can light these fires here to scare away enemies and search for some resources amongst the reeds here. But there is a map available, which is going to give you an indication of where to go. It'll tell you where your last corpse was, for instance, and it gives you vague directions. It doesn't tell you exactly where everything is, but it gives you a sort of indication of there's a room over here, you have to travel this way in order to get there, and dead. That's a trap. This game is a little bit unforgiving, so you're going to get to see that death system in action right now. I respawn here at the fire as a different character, actually. You may notice, if you look very, very closely, which is difficult considering how small your character is, that this is a slightly different character this time. You start with a basic set of equipment, but my lantern is gone now, so I've got to go and recover it, which shouldn't be too difficult because I dropped it on level 1 of the dungeon. And there's the map, just to demonstrate, okay, where am I looking? Okay, so it looks like my corpse is in this area somewhere. But you'll notice this area is not the same as it was. The dungeon shifts and changes every time you go down there. So I'm going to try and grab some resources to craft some items since I have very basic equipment now and try and find my corpse because I need to retrieve that lantern. Otherwise, things are going to get very, very difficult. This is a different area, so we're just going to hop back because we know it's in this room. The game looks very open world, but it is constructed of modular rooms that are sort of procedurally generated. And now we're going to get into a fight. It's a nasty little creature there. You will note the very cool animation, though you may notice a bit of an interlacing effect. It looks like our capture device may not have captured correctly during this particular session, so I apologize for the interlacing. You probably won't notice it too much, but maybe in the combat. That's probably not how the main game's going to look. I looked at my original footage, and it does appear to be interlaced, which is not what we're looking for there, so you kind of get that sort of old school VHS look, which is not what we were trying to do, so I'm very sorry, but I think the footage still looks absolutely gorgeous, so I did want to show you this game despite that fact, and of course the game is still in development. Now anyway, you may have noticed that the combat is a little bit Zelda-esque. You're able to aim your shield in a particular direction by using the thumbstick. So you can angle your shield in order to deflect enemies, you can counter, you can riposte. Some people are going to say, hey, it's Souls-like once again, and yeah, you may certainly be right in that regard, but I found the combat to be very snappy, very responsive, and also extremely cutthroat. You'll notice my character is currently bleeding. I mentioned the survival aspects. One of those is that you can bleed out if you're not careful, so that blood will continue to flow until I do something about that, so I'll want to bandage up. So you do get those more hardcore survival elements to it, but it's a very accessible combat system despite being quite a well-fleshed out combat system with counters and with that directional blocking. With the ranged weapons, you have to draw back the weapon as well, and positioning and the distance between your target and yourself is very important. We've got ourselves a bow here. Unfortunately, we don't have any arrows for it, so I'm not going to be able to do too much with this as of yet, but if I craft some arrows, I'll be able to use that ranged weapon here as well. I do like it when a game that purports to be roguelite in some respect does have a well-fleshed-out combat system. And you know what's weird about this is that one of the weaknesses that these roguelite exploration games have, these dungeon crawlers, is often they create some fairly weak areas that aren't all that well designed, and they don't really feel like they've been handcrafted. The feeling that I get with Below is very much that these areas feel like they were made, tailor-made for this game. They're not just randomly generated, they feel like real levels that actually have some genuine thought put in them, and the exploration as a result of that is rewarding rather than pointless. It's important to note that something like the survival aspect adds to that need to explore. Why look around if you don't need the resources that the land has to provide? Why look around if you're not desperate for food or water, if you're constantly looking to survive? Good question. Well, I think the integration of those mechanics works well. Oh, might want to leave. Very, very close to death here. I'm just going to try and quickly run away. Should be able to defend myself here if I'm careful, but of course I am bleeding, so I'm going to be losing health very steadily unless I do something about that. I'm going to defend with my shield there. It's got a nice, satisfying clank to it when the enemy hits it as well. It really feels like there's some genuine feedback there. Now, here's an interesting little aspect. The game is full of these little eccentric mechanics, I would call them, these little eccentricities. For instance, I just cauterized my wounds in the fire there. And you might think, whoa, that's unusual. Yeah, they came up with some really interesting ideas, some interesting solutions to various problems. For instance, if you're hungry and you can't find any food, if you have a spear and you can find a pool, you can actually go spear fishing, which is almost like a little mini game. It's really just a case of patience. You wait with your spear primed, and then when you see a little bubble in the water, a little ripple, then you stab downwards and hope to catch the fish, and that will become an actual item. There are so many of those little mechanics that I noticed in Below that really makes the game feel surprisingly grounded. I mean, considering this is a fantasy dungeon crawling exploration game, you wouldn't necessarily expect to find those aspects in the game, and yet they are there, and they feel like they should be. They feel like they genuinely flesh the experience out, as opposed to being a waste of time. Now, if I do have a little criticism there, by the way, and this is something that they acknowledged during the developer session, finding entrances to the next area is a gigantic pain in the ass. It really, really is, because it's very difficult to distinguish those gaps from the backgrounds. So I think they need to light those up just a little bit there. Just going to drive our way through here and hopefully not stand in the trap. You'll notice that the more advanced enemies are also able to dodge and counter and riposte themselves, which does make even those smaller enemies quite dangerous. And you can die in a couple of hits, so you have to be very, very careful indeed. So I found myself slowly creeping through and exploring the world, and it felt pretty good, honestly. I felt intimidated, sort of like Dark Souls, certainly in that respect. But I also felt this interesting sense of wonderment. There was definitely not a sense of despair, more of a sense of really wanting to explore this area and find out what's going on in this mysterious dungeon. And of course, the dwarfing sense of scale that the game's got going on. That's just definitely an advantage. I'm going to head on down to the next level of the dungeon and See what goes on there. This is already looking like it's going to be extremely promising. It looks like there's a surprising amount of depth to it. There are hidden mechanics and ideas, which are mostly common sense, but you wouldn't necessarily expect to find in a video game. The idea of heat, for instance, comes into play. As you go lower down in the dungeon gets colder, so fire is going to be an important resource because you'll be able to generate warmth for your character. You wouldn't want your character to freeze to death. And it's strange to find a roguelite that also has those real survival elements in it. You know, I can only really think of Don't Starve as a prime example, but this has a much more developed combat system, and it feels much more like a dungeon crawler, whereas Don't Starve felt like a survival game with very, very basic kind of point-and-click combat that really didn't work all that well. Whereas I actually enjoyed the combat in this game. I did not enjoy it in Don't Starve. I thought it was extremely basic. I think that's one of the weaknesses of that game. But to be fair, the game didn't focus on the combat, whereas this one certainly is. But it is including those cool survival aspects also. There we go. We can get those out of the way. And I can drink here to make sure that we don't have to worry too much about dehydration. I'm just intrigued to see what other ideas they come up with as you go further into the dungeon. I actually spent a good 40 minutes playing this on the floor, which I think was longer than any other game that I got a chance to play. And you don't want to get too arrogant in this game. You will get mugged and killed very easily if you're not careful. And now my lantern, of course, is buried on level 2. It's going to make things a little bit trickier. But I was interested to continue to play it. I just wanted to explore this dungeon for hours, really. And I think this is going to be very, very immersive, certainly once it comes out. You just feel like a very, very small creature in a very large world, and that's a very cool feeling. You don't feel powerful. In fact, it's almost an anti-power fantasy in a way. You feel nervous. You feel like you're creeping forward. You feel like you're the prey sometimes. Now, I'm going to skip forward a little bit here because I did promise that I would show you the bow and arrow. I was able to retrieve the bow and arrow from the little hidden area there. And again, apologies for the interlacing. I did not mean to do that. That was a screw up on my end with the capture. But you'll see that it gives you a little bit of an indication as to where the arrow is going to go. You can actually retrieve the arrows. They are permanent. If they stick into something, you will be able to pick them up. Of course, if you fire them off the screen, then you can end up losing them forever. And they're a reasonably important resource. You know, crafting them does take quite a bit of work, so you might not want to waste them, but the bow is quite a powerful little item. I'm interested to see what other weapons and items you'll be able to put together in the full game, since we only got to try out the spear, the sword and the shield, as well as the sword and the torch. And speaking of the sword and the torch, well, we're getting sort of covered in bats here. They will attack you and bite you at some point, so it can often be a good idea to get your torch out and scare them off. There's a wonderful little animation of you shaking your torch and try to get rid of the bats. I thought that was just a nice little touch, bit of attention to detail. That's another way to describe this game as well, just having an incredible amount of attention to detail in it. Just those little things that really set the game apart from other games in what is becoming quite a crowded genre, honestly. And it wasn't when Cappy first started developing this and announced it in 2013, but the game has taken a long time. But I think it's going to benefit, hopefully, from that long development cycle, because it's going to be quite content-rich and very well fleshed out. Whereas other games, such as Necropolis that we checked out, felt like they were not done. Like, they felt like they could use some more time in the oven. And I'm a bit concerned about games like that, whereas from what I played of this on the show floor, like, this feels so very polished. Even in terms of its UI, Cappy has always created stuff with really interesting aesthetics. I think this is one of the cleanest aesthetics. You may have noticed a bit of a trend lately to go towards clean UI. I think Destiny was a prime example of that, looking towards something a little bit more stylish as opposed to, I guess, video gamey or whatever. This game has a very minimalist UI, and I don't hate that. I think, again, it adds to the immersion, lets you see more of the screen. Why show UI unless you need it? It hides UI elements that you don't need at any particular time. It'll only show you health when you're actually taking damage or bleeding. And that'll pop up above your character as opposed to being a permanent health bar. So you're able to immerse yourself fully in the world with absolutely no distractions on the screen whatsoever. I dig that. I think it's a great choice. Well, we're going to have to forge on and try and find our corpse here. As the enemy is dodging, I was able to just quickly stab it there. The sword does have various attacks as well. It's not just a weapon that you spam. You can stab with it. You can do combos with it. And, of course, you can combine it with your shield as well to create a sword and board combat style. I was a little worried that that combat wouldn't have a lot of depth, but it very clearly does. So that in itself is great. I'm gonna grab a few more items off the floor as we go, and we need to just find out where the corpse is. Could be bloody well anywhere. I'm going to skip forward and we'll find it. Skipping forward just a little bit here to show you a little bit more of the torch. It's just such a beautiful lighting effect. I just want to soak it in a little bit here. There we go. I have unfortunately lost my lantern, so the torch will have to do the job, and I'm currently looking for food and things like that. There's a lot to discover. They didn't really reveal a huge amount of what was going on and what would be happening later in the game. I think they were deliberately evasive in that regard because this, like many other roguelites, is a game about exploration and discovery, and I certainly wouldn't want to spoil too much with it either. But what I played of it and what I saw of it was incredibly promising. I think this is going to be one of the stronger entries in this burgeoning genre that's obviously coming up over the next couple of years. A game that's got a lot of tender loving care applied to it. A game that's got a lot of interesting in-depth mechanics. A game that includes and incorporates survival elements in a way that doesn't feel contrived. In a way that actually makes sense. In a way that adds to the loneliness and the solitude of your experience. The game also supposedly will include some form of multiplayer, although I'm not exactly sure what that will entail. That was not available on the show floor, but details of this game continue to be scant, even after 3+ years of play. You know, it's finally good to get our hands on it, but there's still so much more to find out about Capybaras Below, but I'm very much looking forward to finding out more about it. As to when it's going to come out, well, they narrowed the release date down to summer of 2016, so they claimed at GDC this year. Whether or not that's actually going to happen, I don't know. I just hope they spend as much time as they need to in order to make this game work. Right now, the game is a big mystery, and honestly, I think it should kind of stay that way, because I felt very intrigued by what I played, and absolutely want to discover more on my own. I certainly don't want to spoil any more than is absolutely necessary to demonstrate the game, but it's a beautiful piece of work, and I look forward to it finally coming out. Hopefully you learned a few things. I'm sorry the details were scant, but that was kind of on purpose. They've been hiding things, they've been obfuscating things deliberately. They don't want to tell me too much, they don't want to tell anybody too much, and they don't want to show too much either until the game is out. But what I saw was frankly incredible, and looks like it's going to be an awesome experience. Below, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully coming your way in summer of 2016 on Xbox One and PC. That was a little look at some of the gameplay here from PAX East 2016. Again, I apologize for the interlacing effect. That is not their fault. We had a misconfiguration there with the capture. My apologies for that. Hopefully it didn't ruin it too much. If you like this video, then by all means do feel free to click the like button. If you did not, the dislike button is there also. If you want to check out the rest of my PAX coverage, then I've got a couple of videos at the end there in the end slate which you can click, or you can just search for AVE A GANDER on my channel. You'll see all of the PAX coverage up to this point. There are plenty more games to show you over the next couple of weeks, some new exciting titles. Hopefully you'll check that out and support our coverage, and I'll see you next time.